There we go. Okay. So Little Compton's 18th century women. The beginning of the century, the very beginning of the century, there were about 400 women here. And maybe the majority of them were Sakonnet women. Toward the end of the century, there are 750 women here, very few of whom were women of color. They were mostly European women or women of European descent, mostly English. Mid-century, about 10% of the women living here were women of color. And so we want to make sure we tell a variety of stories today in order to really capture the diversity of the community at that time. In the 18th century, having done research on women in the different centuries, I truly believe that this is the period of greatest invisibility for women historically, at least for this community. In the 17th century, we know about Awashonks, and many of us know about Betty Alden. So we've got a couple of women who kind of rose to a small town celebrity. But I would bet that unless they're your ancestors, I bet that most of us would be hard-pressed to name a woman who lived here during the 18th century. And that's a shame. Once we learned about them, they had fascinating lives and add wonderful new nuance to our local history. Why are they invisible? We don't have any contemporary images of women from that time period. You know, photography had not been invented yet, and the women here didn't have their portraits painted, at least that we're aware of. And if anybody out there knows of an 18th century Little Compton portrait for a woman or a man, please let us know. We would love to have a photograph of that to add to our digital collection. Women are also very underrepresented in the records. Most records focus on men's lives, men's businesses. We just don't see women in the written records like we do with men. And part of that is that many women, if not most, were never taught to write. It was extremely common for women to know how to read. That was very important. The head of the household wanted you to learn how to read so that you could read your Bible. That was being a good Christian here in New England. So even women of color would be taught to read because the head of their household would want them to read the Bible. But it cost extra to send kids to school to learn to write. The teacher charged you extra for writing, and not many families would spend that extra teaching their girls to write. And if your mom doesn't know how to write, it would be hard for her to teach you at home how to write. And so we just see many women signing their name with an X or with their initials. That doesn't mean they can't read, it just means they can't write. As invisible as these women were behind the scenes, they were absolutely essential, essential to survival. Especially early in the century, it was very hard to survive without a partner, whether you were male or female. Running a farm, running a household really required the labor of more than one person. Women were an important part of the workforce and contributed to the family income in real ways, not just childcare, not just housework, not just feeding the male workers, but actually producing goods that could be sold out of the whole household to raise income for the household, whether those goods were textiles or dairy products, and whether they were sold for money or for trade, they were an important part of the family economy and income. Women were property owners, real property, real estate, land, as well as personal property. And in the 18th century, personal property, household goods, textiles were extremely valuable. And land was actually fairly cheap. Women would inherit from their parents, especially if they did not have brothers. They would inherit from their female members of the family. If they were married, all of their possessions immediately went under the control of their husband. But if they were single or once they were widowed, those possessions were theirs to do with what they wanted, and that property could add to the family's wealth. Women managed in their husbands' absences, frequent absences during this century, because it was a century of frequent wars. The men were called away, and the women had to make sure that the family farm, the family business continued. Called away due to death, and women had again to continue in their husband's absence. Many would remarry depending on their ages, but we have women's stories where they were widows for 25, 30 years, living and essentially running the family farm. And of course, women gave birth to the next generation, and we don't want to minimize their parenting contributions, their household contributions. That too is essential. But I think for too long, we may have focused on the household duties, the mothering duties, and forgotten about the economic contributions they made to their families. So we're going to talk about individual women today. And I think they have fascinating personal stories, but from each one, we're going to just try to pull out a little nugget of information that helps us understand the community history maybe a little better than before we began. So Anne Dyer appears in the records very early, 1702. And on some of these slides, you're going to see, rather than birth and death dates, you're going to see appears in the records. That means we can't find their birth and death dates. They were either not recorded, they were not recorded, or we haven't found them yet. This happens an awful lot with women of color. It also happens with poor women. Anne's personal invisibility was pretty consistent. There's no birth record for her. There's no marriage record for her. There's no death record or surviving graves. But we find her as a tangent in the records of the men in her life. And that is how we do a lot of women's history. You know, they may not have historic documents, but if we look at their father's documents, their husband's documents, their master's documents, brothers, sons, we can start to get, they will be mentioned from time to time, and we can start to get a sense of their lives. So Anne appears in 3 different documents in 1702. She coincidentally, all in the same year. She appears in her grandfather Lawrence Springer's will. And in his will, he tells us that she is the daughter of Mary Weaver, that she is his granddaughter, the daughter of his daughter Mary Weaver. He leaves her half a calf. She has to share the calf with her cousin. And we also learn that she's not 18 yet, because she doesn't get the calf until she comes of age. And coming of age for a woman would be 18 years old. So that same year, she appears in her master's will, Thomas Butt's will, because Thomas lived in a coaxit that places Anne in a coaxit. We know that that's where she was living. In the will, we learn that Anne is Thomas's maidservant, and that she is going to be inherited by Thomas's wife, Elizabeth. So there's a question. What does maidservant mean? Because it could mean several different things. In some cases, it could mean a lifelong slave, and Thomas's wife is inheriting Anne forever. More likely, we're looking at an indenture situation, because Lawrence Springer is a white man, and he's already told us that Anne is his granddaughter. So far, to us, Anne is a white woman, young girl, indentured, and the time remaining in her indenture now transfers to Thomas's wife. many indentures ended when a young girl came of age. So her indenture might have ended around 18, right around the time she would have been old enough to legally own property and get that calf from her grandfather's estate. There's a third document, and this is the most interesting. It's Thomas Butt's probate inventory, and it's written by three men, because probate inventories were always done by three neighbors, and they write about Anne in a different way. They call her an Indian woman. And so for the first time, we know that Anne isn't just part white because she's Lawrence Springer's granddaughter. She's also part indigenous, part Native American. And so we have a woman, a biracial woman, living in a Coxet, indentured in Thomas Butt's household. And the really remarkable thing is that Lawrence Springer, a white man, acknowledges her as his granddaughter. That happens two times in this story and also in the story of a woman named Mehitable Dye, very, very early in the 18th century. After that first decade or so, we never see a white man, a white family acknowledge a relative of color anymore. And so to me, that says in this really early part of the century, the concerns that someone might have about having relatives of color, a sense of shame that they might have, that was all less prominent, less existent. And that's something that grew over time, that people would be more hesitant to acknowledge relatives of color. And I think that's a really important story. Sarah Cornell Butts Cole. So we see Butts again. So this is another Coxet story. Sarah Cornell married Zacchaeus Butts, who was Thomas Butt's son. He was a bad guy. Zacchaeus was a bad guy. And Zacchaeus's parents knew that he was a bad guy and tried to protect Sarah when Thomas wrote his will. They gave Sarah her own inheritance in the will, and they clearly and distinctly wrote that Zacchaeus could not get his hands on his wife's inheritance. That is extremely unusual. Typically, the parents would have given their son the inheritance with the understanding his wife would benefit from it too. The fact that they're giving property to a daughter-in-law, and they gave her land, giving land to a daughter-in-law and distinctly saying that their son had no control over this land and could not sell it, tells you how worried they were about their son's behavior. With very good reason, because Zacchaeus sold everything he inherited from them, and then he took his 7-year-old daughter Mary with him as he was running away, leaving town, and he sold Mary as an indentured servant to a family in Tiverton. Presumably took the money from that sale to pay for his travels. Outrageous. Sarah went to the courts. She pleaded with the court to get her child back, to break the indenture. And this was a little trickier than one might imagine. But the court ultimately agreed that Mary could come back, not to her mother, but to her grandmother, who was married to David Lake of Tiverton and lived in a stable, well-to-do household where they know Mary could be taken care of and where Sarah was probably living after her husband abandoned her. So I found this story in the court records, and it was shocking to me that a father would take his youngest child and sell her into an indenture. So it caught my eye, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to share it. I think the really important message here is that colonial courts, although they were, the justices were all men, the juries were all men, colonial women could find justice in the courts. It helped to have powerful white men on your side, someone like David Lake advocating for you, but it wasn't necessary in all cases. And there are a number of cases where poor women, women of color, went to court and the courts would rule in their favor because it was the right thing to do. So let's do Hannah, and then we'll break and see if there's any questions. So if you're thinking of questions, please put them in the chat and Jenna will be looking for them. This gravestone is one of the more famous ones from the old burying ground on the Commons because it's a double gravestone, and those are fairly rare. So this is pretty close to the Congregational Church, not too difficult to find if you want to go see it in person. And it is the combined gravestone of Deborah and Margaret Wood, young women, both of whom lost their lives in 1711, 1712 during a diphtheria epidemic in Little Compton. They called it a putrid sore throat, and it was very serious. The Wood family lost 6 of their 11 children to this disease in about 2 weeks in March. Extremely tragic. Hannah Wood Peck is one of their 5 children who survived. She was 11 years old at the time of the epidemic. So, I mean, I think we don't even want to really dwell on that. So I'm not even, so don't imagine losing 6 children. It's just unimaginable. Maybe a little easier to imagine, but also horrible. Imagine 11 sick children all needing your time and attention, because it's almost certain that the disease would have gone through the whole house. The town of Little Compton had approximately 20 deaths during that spring of 2011, 2012. And the reason for the double dates is in that the old calendar, the year changed in March. So because most of this was happening in March, you'll see the double dates on the gravestones. Very significant as far as gravestones go. Prior to 1711, we see about 2 gravestones, inscribed gravestones, being installed in the cemetery each year. Very modest, very minimal number. Because of this epidemic, 14 gravestones were installed, 7 times the normal number. And that created a permanent shift where more and more people chose to be buried with inscribed gravestones instead of just rocks. Hannah survived. But I think an equally important part of her story is that she didn't live for very long. She died when she was 29 years old. And the evidence indicates that she died of childbirth complications. She was married when she was about 21. She had, 19. She had 6 children in 9 years, which is really pretty close together for colonial times. Typically, babies arrived about 2 years apart, and women had some control over that because they would breastfeed in order to kind of ward off the next pregnancy for a little while. Families, as you know, frequently lost infants. Hannah lost a baby she had named Hannah, and then within 1 year had another baby that she also named Hannah. It was very common to reuse names, the names of children who had died, to give it to the next sibling in hope that they survived. Hannah never really survived from the birth of the second Hannah, and passed away within a few months, weeks of that birth. And, the takeaway, which is, incredibly sad, but incredibly long-lived, is that childbirth-related deaths and injuries lasted until really the beginning of the 20th century. And if someone was lucky enough to survive all of their births, they may have hidden problems, silent problems that would just sort of bother them for the rest of their lives. All right. Jenna, do we have some questions? Should we take a break?
We have a couple of questions. The Hoffmans want to know, what do you see in church records? And they ask particularly about Catholic Church birth and death records.
Catholic Church here until the 20th century. So congregational church does not have birth and death. So the birth and death records for Little Compton are secular. They're all at the town hall. The marriage records for Little Compton are also housed at the town hall, but at a certain point they were gathered from individual justices of the peace, and in far fewer cases at this period of time, clergy. It was much more common to be married by a justice of the peace than a clergyman especially in the early 18th century. I think that has answered that question. If there's something more subtle, maybe they can do a follow-up question.
Okay. And Carl Seabees asks, did women at that time just accept their position in society, or were there those who questioned or even protested their plight?
No public protests, no written protests. I think it was very quiet. I think a lot of women, especially when their husbands died, could elevate themselves in the community, in the household, but it was all done very quietly. Nothing was overt or in your face, because that could cause community backlash. A little later in the century, we see more and more women choosing not to get married, and I think that is a bit of a protest to the typical plight of women. Now, we're talking about love marriages. Children were allowed to pick their own spouses. It's not like, this is all doom and gloom. It's just for medical reasons, life could be very dangerous. And because of the concept of coverture, which is that the husband covered everybody in the household, married women had very little authority over their property, children, and really no say in government.
Who delivered babies in 18th century Little Compton?
Midwives. And there were women in the community who were recognized as midwives. I'm forgetting her first name, unfortunately. It might have been Rebecca, but Mrs. Grinnell was a midwife who would have worked on the West Main Road area, and there is a record of her delivering Mehitable Dye's baby. The reason why there's a record is that Mehitable Dye's baby was illegitimate, and part of a midwife's responsibility was to try and pry out of the woman while she was in labor who the father of the child was. And that was a financial issue as far as the town was concerned, because the town wanted to locate that father and make sure that father paid for the support of the child, so the child did not become a burden on the taxpayers. So Mehitable Dye gave birth to an illegitimate child, and Mrs. Grinnell was called to court to testify to see if they could figure out who the baby's dad was.
All right, that was our last question for now.
Experience Tobe. Experience Tobe in the records is referred to as an Indian woman, and she was free. Now, it's very tempting to say that she was a Sakonnet, and chances are she was a Sakonnet, but I can't be 100% sure, because after King Philip's War, land in Little Compton was given as a reward to many Native people who had been loyal to the English during the war. And those people came from other tribes, other areas, and settled in Little Compton. So we have sort of a mixed Native community in Little Compton after King Philip's War. If we look at Experience's name, her last name is Tobe. It was a custom in Little Compton, and I assume beyond Little Compton, for Native women to take their father, or in some cases it would pass down, so it would be their grandfather's first name as their last name. So I'm very tempted to say that Experience descends from a native man whose first name was Tobe. She appears in the records starting around the time of the French and Indian War, because that's when her husband came home from the war and accidentally started a smallpox epidemic in Little Compton. And so because of the smallpox epidemic, Experience and her husband and her daughters appear in the records, the town council records, far more than most people. I'm going to not go too much into the smallpox story and instead focus on her family relationships and what that meant as far as freedom and lack of freedom meant at the time. So she married a man named Sampson. Sampson is described as a Negro, and he was enslaved by the Shaw family of Shaw Road. So he was a person of African descent, and he was enslaved for life. He had been born in Little Compton, purchased at 18 months old by the Shaws, and brought to their house when he was 18 months old. Experience and Sampson lived near the Shaw farm, but they lived in their own home, even though he was enslaved. And their home is described as a wigwam, or sometimes also, more often today, I think they're called weetus. So this is 1760 or so. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. And it was a real surprise to me when I learned this, that in 1760 Little Compton, not only are we going to have English-style homes in the community, we're also still going to have Native-style homes, Wampanoag-style homes that clearly look that way. And we would have to assume it's within walking distance of the Shaw's farm. Sampson contracted with his master to write a freedom contract. And in the freedom contract, Sampson had to pay a certain amount of money to buy his freedom. And it was really a partial freedom, because in addition to paying the money, Sampson always had to till his master's vegetable garden, and he always had to make the baskets and brooms for his master's household. And what I find fascinating here are the baskets and brooms. Here we have an enslaved man married to a free Indian woman, and I wonder who's really making these baskets and brooms. And I suspect that it is Experience, and I suspect that it may be with the help of her two daughters. And this leads me, and her two daughters, by the way, were born free, because enslavement followed the mother. If a mother was free, we'll say that first. If a mother was free, her children were free. If a mother was enslaved, her children would be enslaved and the property of the mother's master. So it was absolutely brilliant for an enslaved man to marry a free Indian woman, a free woman of color, sometimes a free white immigrant woman. They tended not to be from England, but from other countries in Europe. If you married a free woman, not only could that woman help buy your freedom, but all your children would be free, and that would end the cycle of inherited slavery in your family. So everyone seems to have survived the smallpox epidemic. They seem to come out of it. The girls, unfortunately, were indentured by the town of Little Compton at that time to pay the debts the family incurred during the epidemic. But by 1774, when there was a census taken, we see Experience Tobe as the head of a household. And she's the head of a household of 7 Indian people, all women and all children. So sadly, it seems that Sampson has passed away at this time. but it appears, and I'm really rather confident, that the girls' indentures had ended. They probably had children of their own, and they were all living together as one of the very few Native households, free Native households in Little Compton at that time. Okay, and I think I've made the point that I want to make about the real value of if you are an enslaved person, to a slave man, to marry a free woman had tremendous value, and could really improve your future. So when I began the talk, I said that the women in the 18th century are relatively unknown, or very much unknown. So here's perhaps our only famous 18th century woman. And I bet not many of us would know her name, but we might know her gravestone. And her gravestone is the one on the Commons that says she should have been the wife of Simeon Palmer. So I tell this story a lot. It's one of our better, or one of our weirder, stranger Little Compton stories. So Elizabeth Mortimer actually did marry Simeon Palmer in 1755. We have their marriage record. They had a daughter. She was his second wife. They have a daughter named Lydia. Simeon was a strange guy. Simeon followed one of the practices of the minister at the time, and the minister liked to eat cat meat, raise cats and eat them for meat. So Simeon wanted his family to do the same thing. Elizabeth refused, and she left her husband and his house and took her daughter and moved back to her parents' house and spent the rest of her life there. Now, the story says that Simeon would visit her every Sunday, have Sunday dinner with her. He would bring her his laundry. She would do the laundry. So they maintained a relationship, but she did not live in his household with him. She was not a proper wife. And when she died, he tried to shame and embarrass her and anyone who might remember her on her gravestone by saying she should have been the wife, because she wasn't a proper wife. People are sort of fascinated by this. They make up all kinds of stories. But from the available evidence, what I've just told you is about the closest to the truth that I think we're going to get. It does raise an interesting question. Who were the Mortimers? That is not a Little Compton name. I've tried to look for them, can't really find them. If the story's true and they lived nearby and Elizabeth lived close enough for Simeon to visit her on the weekends, they must have been fairly close. But that's an interesting topic to try and figure out who that family was. And the message we want to pull out from Elizabeth's story is divorce was really quite rare in the 18th century. But if you had strong family support, it was possible for you to leave a husband who, for any reason, was abusive or not working out. Now, Sarah Snell Tompkins, on the other hand, not that she had an abusive husband, this is an example of a young couple who had almost no parental support. Their parents died when they were young. A working class, essentially poor family struggling to get by. She is one of the very few women, and I talked about this in the exhibit opening, where her own words actually survive and will speak for her today, because she dictated a pension application, a Revolutionary War pension application in the 1830s to receive her husband's pension after his death. And she wrote, after our marriage, when my husband was away in the service, I had to do and did many things out of doors that women in this town think they cannot do. We suffered great privation at that time. And I love this quote, and I love this idea that women think they cannot do certain things. Women should be protected or sheltered from heavy outdoor work. In the best of circumstances, women do the indoor work, men do the outdoor work. But then time after time after time, the evidence shows us that this just isn't true. Women did the work that had to be done at the time, whether it was indoors or outdoors. Families were teams, and although labor was divided on a regular basis, in times of crisis, in times of great needs, those gender lines just disappeared, and people did what they had to do in order to survive. We see it in Sarah's story. We see it later on in the 19th century with more genteel farming families where the girls just knew that at a certain time of year, they were going to go out and help their father and brothers in the fields because the work needed to get done. And we see it with immigrant women coming and working in the fields when it was necessary. But, Sarah's story really is a story of poverty. She was a 21-year-old, 6-month pregnant bride when she got married. Her husband, Nathaniel, was being called away on a regular basis to serve in the Revolution. He would be called away for a couple of months and then able to come back. So it was back and forth. He probably served 6 or 7 different tours in the military. They lived on Tompkins Lane on a 12-acre farm. In order to have a good living in Little Compton, you really needed about 60 acres. So to survive on a 12-acre farm was really hard. And I see a lot of families failing. When they inherited 15 acres, they would sell that land and move away because you just really couldn't make it work. This family did, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. This is the farm that I've mentioned before that had cranberry bogs, and maybe that specialty made it a little bit easier for them to survive. Their young son, 25-year-old son, was murdered by shot in the gut by one of his cousins, so they suffered tragedy. And Nathaniel died years before Sarah. She lived just with her daughter, Pamela, for support, and Sarah and Pamela lived on the edge of poverty. That widow's pension for the Revolution, sort of made the difference between life and death for them, and she did receive the pension. So, and again, the story here is that women and girls, regardless of their race and regardless of their class, did hard work when it was necessary. Before we leave this slide, I do just want to point out this beautiful portrait of Sarah Snell Tompkins. It is, of course, an imagined portrait. We don't really know what she looked like, but our board member, Dora Atwater Milliken, very generously offered to make this portrait for us so that we could bring Sarah to life. And it joins some other imagined portraits that Dora has done in our collection. And now it's just really a beautiful set of early Little Compton women that we will keep forever. Hannah Wilbor. We'll do Hannah and then we'll see if there's some more questions. Hannah Wilbor lived, I'm at the Wilbor house right now. Hannah Wilbor lived here in the Wilbor house. A few years ago when we did the historic house tour, I did a lot of research on different families and different houses in Little Compton, and I learned so much by doing that. One of my favorite things that I learned is that parents in Little Compton gave their older sons a farm of their own, and those boys moved away. But they kept the 3rd or 4th son for themselves, had that boy live with them in the homestead farm. And when that boy got married, his wife had to move in with her in-laws and live there for the rest of her life. And their reward was that ultimately they would inherit the homestead farm, which might be a little nicer than the farms their older brothers received. But we see this pattern over and over again, that if you marry a younger son, you don't get a house of your own, you don't get to live by yourself, you move in with your in-laws, and you are assigned a certain part of the house. And that's exactly what happened here at the Wilbur house. In fact, they built an addition right before Sarah came in 1748 to accommodate her and accommodate all the children that they knew she would be adding to the family. So she married William Wilbur. He was a second cousin. She moved into her in-laws' household, and that was her life for the next 26 years. She was a daughter-in-law in the household of her father and mother-in-law. She and her husband became sort of the patriarch and matriarch of the Wilbur house for a few years. And then when she became a widow, she became the head of her own household. And coincidentally, it was also for 26 years. I'm going to jump back to the widow being provided for life. It was very common for husbands to make provisions in their will for their widowed wives. Some were very simple and just directed their children to care for their mother lovingly, and that was it. The father sort of trusted that it would be done. Others were super specific and spelled everything out. And this is just a marvelous example. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but just a marvelous example of the specificity that William listed in his will regarding his wife's care for the rest of her life. And this was to be divided by 2 of his sons, because in addition to Hannah, there were 5 unmarried daughters, none of whom ever married, and a disabled son. So we're essentially talking about the support of 7 people that was shared by 2 of Hannah's sons. 15 bushels of corn, 50 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of beef. And it goes on and on and on. And one of my favorite lines is suitable sauce for the meat. So to have sauce with your meat was very important. And William wanted to make sure that Hannah had sauce for her meats. Another thing that's very specific is 6 cords of firewood. And he goes on to specify that it be cut to a certain length to fit in the fireplace that you see on the screen in front of you, delivered to the door and cut to fit this particular fireplace. Those provisions lasted until Hannah's death, and then they continued for the 5 unmarried daughters to a lesser degree. They got a little bit less from their brothers, but their brothers and then their nephew provided for them for the rest of their lives as well. And so when we think about all these poor young people who are having such trouble launching into this big, expensive world we're putting them out into, we have to remember that in the 1700s, each of us parents would be giving all of our boys a farm when they came of age. So they'd be completely launched and ready to go into the world, at least in rural areas. And in the cities, I can only imagine it would be to set them up with some sort of business and a home. Another really important takeaway message here is these beautiful farmhouses that we have here in Little Compton. We cannot think about them as single family homes. They were essentially divided up into apartments, and different generations of the family, different branches of the family would be assigned different portions of the house and would live together. Very, very much like the tenement apartment buildings that came along in cities a little bit later. The women would share the kitchen, share the basement, share the attic, but people had their own private living spaces. And census takers recognized that these houses were made up of separate households and would list people as separate households, even though they were living within the same building. Okay, Jenna, any questions?
Yes. Can you tell us the source of the cat meat story?
So that is a story that's just been repeated over and over and over again. I recently read the writings of, and we have the original writings of Sarah Soule Wilbur in our archive, And she is the first one to write that story down. And she does say the specific minister. And I want to say it's Billings, Richard Billings. But the name of the minister, I'm a little shaky on.
Okay. Why did people need about 60 acres to survive? What was the acreage used for?
The acreage was your farm, and your farm provided you with a living. So most of the farms were, so you had to grow a lot of different things on your farm. Flax to make linen. You had sheep to raise wool. You had to grow corn for your own consumption and also for your animals. Corn grew much better than the other grains, so it was really a corn-based diet. You would have a few dairy cows, like 4 or 5 is kind of normal. You'd have a few pigs for slaughtering. And what I see is that if you had 100 acres, life was stable. Life would be stable for your children. They could inherit and stay in town and be stable. If you have about 60 acres, life could be stable for you, and a kid who inherited 60 acres could stay here too. What I see over and over again is if you break up the farm into chunks that are smaller than 60 acres, the kids can't make a go of it here. They might try, but then they fail, and you see them selling the property and leaving town, going to Newport and being a cordwainer, or going to Newport and being a sailor or running a store, because you just can't produce enough corn and enough linen and enough wool to provide an income for your family unless you have about 60 acres.
How exactly did Native women become enslaved in the first place?
So the way most Native women became enslaved was by being captured or by surrendering during King Philip's War. And they were either enslaved for life or enslaved for a term, and the term was 12 years. So enslaved local Native women were very common in the 1600s, but by the 1700s, it was becoming a little less common because the term slavery was over. There were still a few slaves for life, but there is this basic premise in slavery that you don't enslave people who are local to you, because they will run away and go back to their own people, or their own people will come and get them, and that could be violent. So it's dangerous to enslave local people. So there were actually laws passed that you could no longer enslave local Indians, and so local Indian enslavement really goes down to 0 in the 1800s. And what we see instead when we're talking about Indian enslavement is the enslavement of Carolina Indians or Spanish Indians, which were Native people from the southern territories that were brought north. So there's a distance. You know, those people in Carolina are not going to come to Rhode Island and try and redeem their enslaved loved ones. You're safer enslaving that person. So it's just to be clear, Experience Tobe was a free Indian woman who married an enslaved African-American man.
What records illuminate the apartment-style living in the big farmhouses?
Lots and lots of probate records that say, my wife is supposed to have this room, my daughter is supposed to have this room, my son is to have the east side of the house, over and over and over again. And then when the census taker comes, and there are censuses in the 1700s, They mark how many buildings they are and how many families they are, and they list the families by name. So you'll see one building with 2 families living in it. Hannah, and very specifically, Hannah Wilbor is listed in this house. And I know that she was given the west side of the house, which was the newer, nicer part of the house. And her son Jonathan and his family were given the east side of the house, which was older. And the census taker records that. One building, Hannah Wilbor, right next door, Jonathan Wilbor. And that's one example, but we see that in numerous families in town.
Do you know which house on Shaw Road Experience and Sampson worked on?
So I know the name of the owner, but I don't know if the house survived. It was William Shaw, and it was about 1760 that this was happening. And then there's an Anthony in there as well. I'm pretty sure, I think Anthony was William's son.
How did they create or grow the products that they sell, and who did they sell it to?
So main products, the main primary products from Little Compton appear to be textiles. So you would grow a plant called flax and process the fibers into a cloth called linen, sell the linen. You would raise sheep, process their fibers into wool. The women were spinners, and early in the century, men are repeatedly listed as weavers, which was a little bit of a surprise to me. I didn't realize weaving was a man's job, but it was. And then I think it sort of transitioned to men and women as the century wears on. So families would produce homespun cloth that they would sell. Families would also produce dairy products, butter and cheese, just sort of the normal way. You would milk your 5 or 6 cows, separate the cream. Cheese is a more complicated process, but we have lots of cheese making equipment here in the collection. And I mean, that was smart because milk would go bad in a couple of days, but if you turn it into butter, then that nutrition, those nutrients last much longer. If you turn it into cheese, those last much longer. First and foremost, you take care of your family. You make sure you have enough to feed your family, get through the winter. But if you feel like you have extra, then you sell it. And who do you sell it to? Mostly Newport. At this period of time, mostly Newport. There were numerous ferries. There were a couple of ferries going back and forth between Little Compton and Newport, so lots of ways to get products across. The people in Newport needed produce, so there would be vegetable gardens too. Needed produce, needed dairy products. But we also have to remember that Newport was a really busy, successful shipping port. So things would be sold to the people in charge of provisioning a ship, and Little Compton goods would be loaded up on ships. Those ships would go everywhere in the Atlantic world. So lots of New England produce, lots of Little Compton products would go to the Caribbean and provide for the plantations in the Caribbean. Other things that I see being sent to the Caribbean, spermaceti candles made by a native woman in Tiverton. Barrel staves, very common. We hear about shoes going down to the Caribbean. Salted meat, right? So everybody has 3 pigs. You know that your family only needs 2 pigs to survive the winter. You've got 2 extra barrels full of salted pork. You're going to sell those. And those barrels of salted pork can end up in Africa. You know, there's a record I have of slave captains off the coast of Africa trading for salted pork in order to complete their deal. It might have been salted beef, but they wanted the meat in order to seal the deal. Oh, Jenna, you're muted.
When was the first census?
So that, I'm going to grab a book and see if I can give you a real answer here. We were part of Massachusetts first, and then we were part of Rhode Island. The first census that I have used in my work is 1748 census for Rhode Island. And that took place right when 5 towns from Massachusetts were given to Rhode Island. So we've got a 1748, a 1755, 77, 82, 90, and 1800. So the early half of the century, we're kind of in the dark, but the second half of the century is very well documented. There were earlier censuses in Rhode Island, but they don't pertain to us because we weren't part of Rhode Island.
Okay, and then we are out of questions for now.
Great. Margaret Peckham Briggs. Margaret is one of my favorites. I couldn't get a birth date or a death date on her. She's just appearing in the records in the 1740s, around the time of her husband's death. And we know about Margaret because her business kept appearing in the newspapers. So colonial newspapers are a great source of information for certain women. We have some newspaper stories pinned up in the exhibition. Women appeared very infrequently in this century. I think we only have 38 women's newspaper stories for a 100-year time period, but Margaret appears in about 3 of them. Because her husband died in debt, and as the administratrix of his estate, she had to keep putting notices in the newspapers to alert his creditors, and then later to sell the property and try and pay off these debts. Margaret and her husband John Briggs owned an inn, and because of the newspaper advertisements, I learned that there was a distinct road that went directly from Fogland Ferry to the New Bedford area. And it wouldn't have been called New Bedford at this point in time. It would have been a part of Dartmouth. But it's really interesting to think about a road connecting Fogland Ferry to the port of Dartmouth, because from there, then you could go to Newport and beyond. For 20 years, Margaret and John ran what we can only imagine was a very successful group of businesses, cluster of businesses in this site. They had a malt house, 3 stables, a warehouse, and in the warehouse they ran a tavern and a store. They also had a house on top of that. But in 1763, John died in debt and left Margaret in a whole bunch of trouble. So the first thing widows do when they need to pay debt, because it's very complicated to sell land when you're a woman, is they sell their movable property or some of their valuable movable property. The most valuable thing that Margaret owned was an enslaved woman whose name we never learn, and that woman's infant. They're sold immediately. They're sold at an excellent price, and that sort of keeps Margaret and her children afloat for a while. We see Margaret going to the town council in Little Compton and getting liquor licenses in her own name. So she's continuing to try and run these businesses by herself. I think she does that 3 different times. For any of us who grew up here, we talk about why there are no 4 corners, and one of the explanations is, well, there's no 4 corners because you can have a tavern at a 4 corner, and Little Compton was so pure and Puritan, we didn't want taverns. Well, that's baloney, because the Little Compton Town Council gave out liquor licenses like they were candy. There were normal liquor licenses that were given out every year for hard liquor. There were other liquor licenses just for beer. On election day, they gave out special election day liquor licenses for one day, you know, pop-up taverns. So we loved taverns here, and there were, I think, more than we imagined there were. Despite her best efforts, Margaret could not make a go of the business. We have to remember, you know, prior to John's death, John was working here, Margaret was working here, the enslaved woman was working here, at least 3 people to keep this business running. Now Margaret is doing it by herself, and it's just not working. She can't pay her husband's debts. So the law gives her the widow's third. She is entitled to 1/3 of her husband's estate, even before his debtors. So no matter what happens, she gets 1/3 of the estate. She cannot sell any land without permission from government officials. She gets that permission because they see it's clear she's not going to be able to do it any other way. And then we see a series of advertisements where she's selling 2/3 of the property. It sold, and it appears that Margaret moved away, and one of my records indicated that she moved back to the Newport area to be with her family. So although there were, you know, no legal barriers to especially a single woman owning and running a business, again, we're in that situation where there's just so much work to be done that unless you have a partner, it's just really hard to get everything that needs to be done accomplished over the course of a day. So just to do something a little different, I thought we would talk about these 2 women at the same time. I knew about both of them separately, but as I was doing a little new research for this project, this newspaper article in the middle popped up. And as I was reading it, you know, lights started going off in my head because this is a newspaper story about a very serious fire at a home in Little Compton, and I'll give you some details in just a moment. Both of these women were present at this fire. Both of these women lived in the same household. Jane was enslaved by Thomas Church. There are many Thomas Churches, so to be clear, this Thomas Church was the grandson of Benjamin Church, and he had a very large farm at Seconic Point. Mercy Church Brownell is one of Thomas Church's 17 children. Mercy would have been 13 when the fire struck. Jane would have been present at Mercy's birth. Jane would have helped raise Mercy. So on the day of the fire, April 20th, 1769, Thomas Church and his wife are away. And I purposely learned the wife's name because I wanted to be able to give it to you. And unfortunately, there's so many Thomas Churches and they had so many wives that it's just gone right out of my head. I want to say that it was Ruth. Were away in Newport because there was an election. So they left their children, and I think there were about 11 children at this point, nobody older than a teenager, home alone with their servants. And it was one of the largest households in Little Compton. They tended to have about 4 or 5 servants at any given time. And the servants were a mix of enslaved African-American people and either indentured or wage-earning Indian people, Native American people, Indian women specifically. So the article says, there was a raging fire. It started in the attic and spread so quickly that there was really nothing that could be done. They make a point to say that Thomas and his wife are away from home and there were no men at home. So the enslaved men who worked on the farm were not there at the time of the fire. It was strictly women and children in this fire. And the article goes on and it talks about how the fire spread so quickly through the house and filled the downstairs chambers not just with smoke, but with flames. The neighbors came, they tried to save the property, and they failed. And the article is really sort of mourning the loss of the property, 600 pounds of property, which is an enormous sum. The churches were very wealthy, their furnishings were beautiful, all their beautiful furnishings were lost. People were endangering their lives going into the fire to try and save the furnishings and the clothing, and they managed to save some of Thomas's clothes. They managed to save some of his wife's dresses. But for the 11 kids, the 15 people who were there, the children and the servants, the article says they escaped with just the clothes on their backs, not a single change of clothes for these 15 people. So it was a huge loss of property. The people in Newport actually took up a collection to try and raise funds for Thomas Church to make up for his lost property. But what the article doesn't say or doesn't talk about is really what I can only imagine would be the heroism of the women and the teenage children who were present there that day, who saved every single life. No one was injured in this fire. Jane played a role in saving 5 small children, including her own son, Caesar, and 4 of the small church children. The teenagers, like Mercy, at least saved themselves, may have helped in saving the smaller children, and they all survived this trauma together. And I just thought when I came across this, I just thought it was fascinating to think about these 2 women, very different lives, living in the same household, experiencing the same tragedy, trauma together, and coming out of it. And just a side note with Jane was enslaved by Thomas Church and his family for somewhere between 35 and 40 years. Thomas had several wives. Jane lived in his household and was a part of his life longer than either of his 2 wives. So this is a very long-term, very important relationship. I'm not implying that there was anything romantic or inappropriate going on, but just Jane was the consistent figure in his life from the time he was a teenager until the time he was an elderly man, when his first wife died. Died in the Church family. Judith Waite Head. So here we have another daughter-in-law. Judith was from Portsmouth, and I think that's kind of important because we talked a little bit about cousins, second cousins marrying each other. That's not so good. And so it's good to see people from other communities coming into the town and marrying as well. She moved into her in-laws' house, just like Hannah Wilbor did, and her house is the house that today we call the Head House on Goosewing Farm. And it still stands, and it's been beautifully preserved. What I love about this is the painting, which is an imagined painting, was done by Meredith Wilds Cornell, who grew up in the Head House in the 1940s and 50s, and remembers that house intimately as a little girl who grew up there. And for one of our previous projects, Meredith offered to make this painting for us. So it's women at work making textiles in the Head House, authentically representing the Head House, authentically representing the furniture, because if you look, they're sitting in chairs that we call Little Compton chairs, and they're very, very common in town. They're William and Mary banister back chairs, but with that particular type of decoration on them. They're specific to Little Compton. But here's the really wonderful thing. Meredith used the faces of her living own family members, her mom, her sisters, to represent the faces of the women in this portrait, in this painting, and I just love that. It shows multiple generations living in the house. It shows the little children sort of being watched over by an elder so that the younger women can get their work done. There's really a lot here to love in this painting. Judith married into the house in 1755. She brought with her movable property. You know, when sons left home, parents would give them a farm. When daughters left home, parents would give them a house full of furniture, as much as you could afford. And furniture and textiles and mattresses, especially feather beds, were extremely expensive. So the things a daughter-in-law brought into the household were very valuable. They became her husband's, but at her husband's death, everybody remembered that they were hers, and they became hers again. When Judith died, she had her own will and her own probate inventory, which is a little unusual for women. It focused on her clothing. She had an abundance of clothing, more than I think we think colonial women had. Again, the probate is really detailed and it's really fun to read because it describes each of the dresses, but I'm going to do it quickly. 6 dresses, 6 skirts, 3 bodices, 8 caps, 8 shirts, which would be sort of like a chemise or an undergarment, 6 pairs of winter stockings, and 2 pair of summer stockings. In addition, she owned 33 sheets, which were probably something she had made in her own household, and at her death, she had 52 skeins of yarn waiting for her to do something with. Little Compton was very clearly a textile producing community, and during the Revolution, when everyone did agree not to purchase cloth from England anymore, Little Compton was able to provide our extra cloth to other communities. This document came to light during this project, and I just thought it was fascinating. It is a proclamation from the Council of War for the state of Rhode Island in 1779, and it tells each town in the state how many pairs of stockings they need to contribute to the war effort. Every town was required to provide a certain number of stockings because the Army needed 3,000 pairs of stockings. Little Compton's quota was 120 pairs of stockings. We imagine, and I think we imagine quite correctly, that it is women who are going to be making these stockings. And they're going to be paid £3 per pair of stockings. And I just thought it was very interesting to compare Little Compton's 120 quota with some of the other towns in the community. Tiverton is higher. Tiverton was always in colonial times a bigger, more populated, more business-oriented town than Little Compton. But look at Barrington, Bristol, and North Providence. Look how low their quotas are compared to Little Compton. You know, things were different. We were a populated, developed, politically prominent community in the 18th century, very different than our rural persona today. So we'll do Suki, and then maybe we'll take a break again and see if there's any more questions. This is another document that I just found during the Women's History Project. As more and more things are digitized, there's just more and more things for us to find out there. I used to say that there was only one woman, enslaved woman, who ran away in Little Compton. Her name was Kate. Not true. Suki ran away as well. And the really striking thing is the date. Suki ran away from her master, Peregrine White, in 1799. So after the Revolution, almost the turn of the century, we still have enslaved people here in Little Compton. Suki was 40 years old. She self-emancipated. She freed herself by running away. And if you check the census records, Peregrine White had no people of color in his household in 1790. So Suki would have been added to the household after 1790. And he has no people of color in the household in 1800. So it feels like she didn't get captured. She didn't return. There's a marriage record in Providence on July 6th, but there's two different records, and one says 1800 and one says 1801, so we don't know, for A. Suki White and A. George Peters. Is it Little Compton Suki White? I don't think we're going to be able to know for sure, but it's kind of nice to think that maybe it was. So slavery in Rhode Island was legal until 1843, so that there were still a small number of enslaved people here in 1799 is not surprising. Let me see what the next slide is. We may as well do Kate since we're on slavery, and then we'll break. Kate was the last enslaved woman in Little Compton. She was freed when her master's will went through probate on August 5th, 1816, so we can pinpoint it to a day. And on August 15th, I'm going to be doing a talk on slavery and freedom in Little Compton, and I hope you'll join us for that. She married an enslaved man named Prince Grinnell in 1784, and they had two boys. And the boys may have been twins because they just sort of appear in the records at the same time together. Even though Kate was enslaved, and at the time in 1784 enslaved for life, her boys were born free because of a law in Rhode Island called Gradual Emancipation Law that went into effect in March of 1783. Any child of an enslaved woman born after that date in March in 1783 was born free, but would be indentured to their mother's master until they were adult. So the mother's master was responsible for housing them, clothing them, feeding them. That prevented tax dollars from being spent on these children. And then the master or mistress received the benefit of that child's work once that child was able to work. And children were perceived as being able to work around 6 years old. So there was plenty of work years between 16 and 18, or between 18 or 6 and 21. The script at the bottom directs Kate's owner's grandson to provide her in her old age. We see that a lot in New England. New England families tended to take their responsibility toward elderly slaves seriously and to provide for them in their old age. They didn't always free them. This is a little unusual to be freed and taken care of, but it was considered not necessarily illegal, but very inappropriate to free an elderly slave without support, to basically abandon them. It did happen. It happened here in Little Compton, actually in the Peabody family, but it was fairly rare and much more common to see elderly enslaved people cared for by the family that they served for all their years. All right, so why don't we see if there are any questions here?
Nina Evison would like to know what houses of worship were open in the 18th century. Was there a requirement that everyone be of the same faith to live in the community?
So, no, pretty good religious diversity here. In the 18th century, there was a Baptist church in Adamsville, and though technically it is in Tiverton, many Little Compton people worshiped there, so Baptist. The Congregational Church on the Commons, which, you know, there are different shades of Protestantism even at that time. The ministers were coming from Harvard for the most part. It's sort of a traditional Calvinist Protestant church. And then the Quaker Meeting House. And there were Quakers here from very early on. The first meeting house was built right around 1700, and it was consistent through the century. There were no Catholics. It was probably life-threatening to be a Catholic in this area, at least in the early 18th century. Protestants really equated Catholics with the devil, and you were in danger if you announced your faith. No Anglicans per se. However, the Congregational Church would invite Anglican ministers from Newport to come over and preach in the Congregational Church. So it wasn't like that. So that was a pretty pleasant back and forth relationship. There was no Anglican church here, but they didn't have a hatred for the Anglican church. The minister was welcome to preach here. So essentially three: Quaker, Baptist, and Congregationalists all throughout the century. In the 19th century, it gets a little more complicated. We have Mormons here as well. They didn't last. And we have Mormons and Methodists coming in the 19th century.
Polly's aunt, Dorothy Shaw, it says Burgard, but I think it might supposed to be saying Burchard, not sure, told a story that the first dwelling of the Shaws was burned by the Indians. This would be where Chase Point is at this time. Have you heard of it?
I would bet good money that no house in Little Compton was ever burned by the Indians. The Indians were a totally subjected people by the time the English moved to Little Compton. It's made up.
Okay, and is Mercy Church Brownell related to Susan B. Brownell Anthony?
Not in a clear-cut way. Yes, probably, because they've got the same last name, but it's not like a direct, oh yeah, she's her granddaughter or anything along those lines. I should say, because this will kind of lock who Susan Church Brownell is for us, the beautiful colonial house at the triangle at the end of Meeting House Lane and where West Main Road is, that was Mercy Church Brownell's later in life married home. She and her husband Sylvester Brownell built that house, built that farm, known for a long time as Carlton Brownell's house. Now we call it Fred's house, but that beautiful house was Mercy's house.
All right, we're out of questions for now.
Might almost be out of slides too. Let's see. So Lois Wilbor. Lois Wilbor also lived in the Wilbor house. She lived here for 92 years. Never married. Her four sisters also never married. We talked about Hannah Wilbor. She's Hannah Wilbor's daughter. Lois lived through four patriarchs here, one matriarch, her mother. In total, 6 generations of Wilbors lived in this house. Lois knew 5 of those generations. And I think about that a lot. That is a long, consistent life that you would know 5 generations of your family all in the same house. Just like her father provided for her mother, Lois's father provided for her in his will. So she always had the Wilbor house as a safety net. But she and her sisters did not take advantage of that. And I get the sense that that was pretty consistent in the community. Even women who were financially stable were working women. And Lois worked and earned her own money and kept her own money. I'm almost certain she was taught to spin, just like so many women, but she also became a school teacher and she taught at Peck Top School, saved her money, invested it. She had bank accounts when she died. She owned property when real estate when she died, and she inherited from her sisters. So she had a modest amount of wealth at the end of her life, most of which she gave back to her nephew, who was at that time the patriarch of the Wilbur house. So, she benefited from living in the Wilbur house all these years, and then at her death gave all that she had back to the next generation, who was going to continue living here. I took a course not too long ago, and sometimes you just remember these things from the courses that we take. Living as a single person was nothing special. It was an ordinary, commonly accepted option until World War II. And then attitudes shifted and changed. And at that point, somehow being single became somehow less than being married. So for years and years and years, deciding to be a single person and living as a single person was just a choice, just a sort of an even choice. World War II changed that. It became, at that time, something where maybe you'd be sorry for someone who wasn't married, or marriage was the preferred state. And I think it's important to recognize that. I think, the pendulum is swifting in the other direction, where now being single is, or being married is not necessarily a preferred state any longer. Being single is, again, just one of many choices. But the idea of poor spinsters or feeling sorry for spinsters, that's a very modern idea. That's not an old idea. And so women like Lois and her sisters didn't live unusual lives. They were living normal lives at the time. All right, so that was our last slide. The Women's History Project received tremendous community support. We're very grateful to our sponsors, and the project is not over. So if you have a family member that you would like to write about, or if you would like to share your own autobiography, if you're a woman, please do so. littlecompton.org has all the information that you would need in order to do that, and essentially it's as simple as sending an email, and we'll get that story up on the website. All right, so that is the end of the talk. Jenna, do we have any additional questions?
We do not yet. Give people a moment to write any remaining questions they have, but it looks like people got them out as we went along, so I don't suspect there will be many.
I'm just checking the time to see how long I kept you all.
Where did Lois Wilbur teach?
At Peckham's School, and Peckham's School was located on West Main Road at that time, probably across the street from Taylor's Lane at that time. So a nice, easy walk from the Wilbur house.